Hi, this is Paul. Jordan's been putting out videos lately. First, the Douglas Murray conversation, which was outstanding, and then the Peter Kreeft conversation, which was outstanding. And of course, you can see my commentary on the conversation quality of the Douglas Murray video wasn't outstanding. There was a lot of good stuff in it. And then this video with Matthieu Pageau. Now, Matthieu Pageau has become a very interesting figure in this little corner of the internet. Of course, his brother Jonathan is very well known and out there up front and has been doing a lot of video work and speaking and all sorts of things, popularizing the work that Jonathan says all the time that he and Matthieu, his brother, developed over years and decades. Matthieu, of course, wrote this book, The Language of Creation, which is a very interesting book. I remember when I first saw this book, I just didn't quite know what to make of it. But over time, listening to Jonathan, I've sort of begun to understand it and began to incorporate it. I just finished my rough draft today, and yeah, you can see just how much Jonathan and Matthieu via Jonathan have colonized me and inputted things into my mind and changed my perspectives. But there's an early conversation with Jonathan and Matthieu that's out there. We don't see much of Matthieu. And for whatever reason that is, that's just been the case. So then to have him pop up with a conversation with Jordan is quite something. And the conversation itself is quite something. There's a ton in this. Some of it is just flat out Pageauian. Conversations about listening to the animals. Again, this had some of the sense of the early biblical series, that there were just some thoughts and insights that were shared in this video which just sort of grabbed me. And they're new, and you have to think about them. And I think a lot of people watching this video, especially if they're not sort of deep nerds in this little corner of the internet, yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. And so then I thought, well, what do I want to say about this conversation? Because again, I think there's a ton in here that is very worthwhile and very worth thinking about. But partly, again, because of Jordan's reputation, and partly because Matthieu is so new in many ways as a person in video, I'm not quite sure how the reception of this video is going to go. And so I wanted to begin by talking about religion, because the modernistic frame in a secular society sees religion as a very particular subset of the world instead of as an operating system to pursue shalom or well-being or glory. And so in that sense, the continual recession of the new atheists sort of haunt this conversation. Sam Harris will be mentioned a number of times, but the critique of the critique, which has a degree of validity, of okay, well, how can we employ symbolism in a way that doesn't just run amok by having random associations or idiosyncratic associations or individualist associations? So, as I've mentioned many times, I have a fair amount of experience with schizophrenics. There are a lot of group homes in the neighborhood. It's a fairly common thing for me to attempt to engage the schizophrenic in conversation. And what you very quickly realize is that schizophrenics are making all sorts of symbolic associations all over the world. The rest of us listen to them talk and say, that's crazy, and we don't go along with it. And the test, in many ways, is whether or not the world itself is sifting the interpretation and showing it to be, in a significant way, valid. Now, I've talked a lot in my sermons lately sort of about nature religion versus escapist religion. And an escapist religion approach says that, well, the world is chaotic and fundamentally meaningless. Therefore, any attempt to engage in the world will be futile. Now, one of the points that Jordan has been making repeatedly in his last videos, this is, as you watch Jordan for a long time, you'll notice that, just as with preachers, certain ideas that he's working on in the background sort of come to the fore. And so they get repeated in successive videos. And there was again recently one in the conversation with Douglas Murray that is important, and a background here.
I'd like to make a comment on the scientific front too, and I really started to think about this after talking to Dr. Dawkins, and I suppose to some degree to Sam Harris too, on the atheist front. And so I know that as the death of God in the Nietzschean terms has progressed, we've lost faith in an increasing range of underlying realities, and the first might be the deistic reality. But then what we've seen happening under the onslaught of postmodernist thought is that we're starting to lose faith in the idea of fact itself. And then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well,
okay, I want to slow him down. We're starting to lose idea of fact itself, because the idea of a fact is built on, again, it's a presuppositionalism. There's a faith assumption that facts exist, are independent of me, are accessible by me, and operate in a way in the world that you can form expectations and hypotheses about and move towards them. All of that is an assumption of faith in the world. That is the point that he's making here.
In some sense, and then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well, in some sense, it's there's deistic preconditions, because one of the things that characterizes scientists, and this includes people like Dawkins, who's a real scientist, is that the scientist presumes axiomatically that there's a transcendent realm.
Now again, axiomatically, this is a presupposition. This is a presumption. This is not something that's provable. This flows from your worldview. It is a product of your worldview. It is an article of faith of the religion that you possess. You might say, well, I'm not a religious person. I believe in science. Then that is your religion. Then these are your presuppositions. Then these are your articles of faith. These are your axioms.
Presumes axiomatically that there's a transcendent realm outside the domain of epistemological theory. So if you have a scientific theory and you're a real scientist, you know that your theory, which is really what you see when you look at the world, you know that your theory is insufficient in comparison to the reality that transcends it.
All right, so basically, even if you say, I believe in science, I don't believe in the supernatural, all of these assumptions are baked into your worldview. They are like your religion. They are the glasses that you see through. These are the assumptions beneath your world. Now you might say, well, I never came forward in the atheist church to profess my faith in this. No, you were raised in it by all the people around you. You caught it like the Christians caught Christianity, and like Muslims caught Islam, and Hindus caught Hinduism, and everyone in the world imbibes in themselves the map of their culture, filtered through hierarchies of status. Oh, the really important people, they don't go to church, therefore church is meaningless, therefore I won't go to church. The really important people, they do these things, and so I will act like them. All of that aspiration is always working societally around us, and so you imbibe, you take on these maps yourself. And Jordan in the last few videos has basically stated this in this way, which is a super helpful way of saying, there's your religion. That's what it is.
And so then as a scientist, what you try to do is you try to pit your theory up against the transcendent reality so that it fails, so that you find something about what you don't understand that is able to make itself manifest. Then you adjust the theory to get a better grip on the world, and you assume while you're doing that that there's an underlying logic to the transcendent object, and that analysis of that underlying object is both corrective and redemptive. And as far as I can tell, those are all essentially axiomatic religious claims, and that they're preconditions for any true empirical science. And so what that implies is that if we lose faith in the transcendent hierarchy, we might lose the entire scientific endeavor.
Now, that is, again, Douglas Murray's kind of like, well, is that really what we're talking about here? Because that wasn't really my question. But what Jordan said there, and he said almost a very similar thing in the Peter Kreeft conversation, is really vital.
Empirical is both corrective and redemptive.
Okay, it's corrective and redemptive. Well, what do you mean it's corrective and redemptive? Redemptive sounds like one of these religious words. No, you mean that if you get your, let's say it's science about COVID, or science about cancer, or science about how to make mag lifts better so that they save electricity, it's redemptive and corrective. Now suddenly you can have better medicine to fight COVID or cancer, or to have your trains run on time, and to make the world more efficient. And because these are all goals and values that you are pursuing, what you have around you is an enormous religion. And this is happening. And it is just as much of a religion as King Agamemnon. He wants to get over to Troy to take back the wife of his brother Menelaus, and he's not getting favorable winds from the gods, and so he sacrifices his daughter. That's just as much science for him, just as much religion for him, because he's trying to get his ships to Troy to get back Helen for Menelaus. That's religion. And this is why the Greeks didn't see their own religion, the Romans don't see their own religion, and people who, unless they are categorized as religious in our society, don't see their own religion. But this is, in fact, how they are functioning in the world towards the ends that they desire. That is one's religion. This is what they do, and this is why all of life is religion in many respects. Now, to go back to the other video, what Jordan has been trying to do is to basically get at the deep assumptions of our civilization that he feels that are under threat. And again, just like he said, the idea of a fact is under threat by certain types of postmodernists. And actually, they'll have, I think, Jordan is getting better and better, I think, at articulating some of the points that he's making with respect to that. But what about Matthieu Pageau? Now, with the large recession of modernity that's taking place, what we're seeing are new systems sort of emerging, or rather the reemergence of old systems that had been sociologically dismissed. And what that means is that with the emergence of a new system, or the reemergence of an old system, there are going to be interpreters who come back and rediscover old ways at looking at the world. Now, those of us who participated in the conference now have access to the records from Thunder Bay, and I haven't sort of organized them sufficiently to have access to them on all of my computers. But one of the really interesting points that Jonathan Pageau made in his iconography lecture presentation there was that this iconography was the language of the early church. And that's a powerful statement. And so what happened with Jonathan and Matthieu is that, in a sense, sort of like twins, they developed this language, and Jonathan has been talking about it on videos, and Matthieu talked about it in his book. And we're rediscovering this language and asking ourselves questions of utility. And of course, Jordan's been very interested in this because he's looked at sort of the language of the world through symbolism through dreams. Remember, he's a Jungian psychologist. And how is this, and figuring out ways to communicate its relevance to the world. Now, I'll play a little bit of this, but I'm actually not going to play a lot of this video in this video.
It was really something to read your book. It's not like any other book on religious thinking that I've encountered. I'm very familiar with work by Mircea Eliade, say, and Carl Jung, and they're much more tilted towards the imagistic and technically religious side and become symbolic and narrative in some way that's akin to, say, Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. They're more on the poetic side of things, but your work...
Now, what he's saying is that a lot of these authors that he's just mentioned are inscrutable. There's just page after page after page of really dense text, symbolic text, and to figure out what these authors are saying is really, really a challenge. And that is very different from the approach of this book. Now, this book in many ways seems simple. I've done some videos on it before. I should go after it. The chapters are short. The language is clear. There are a lot of diagrams. In that sense, it isn't inaccessible like Jung or Eliade or Newman. It seems accessible, but that doesn't mean you'll just sort of read this book and be transformed. This gets into the accessibility of other ways of approaching the world. Now, we all sort of grow up in a culture, and we map our world and our parents' minds and all those other minds, we map them inside of ourselves. And they become the basic operating system by which we approach the world. And it's very different. And this is why you have these stark dissimilarities between worlds. So twice this week I was at classis meetings. Classis meetings are regional meetings in my denomination. And because I have been doing so much work in this little corner of the internet and in these conversations, and because I'm very familiar with being in a very secular society, because many of the conversations that you watch on television doesn't have religion as such, I'm always feel a little bit dislocated when I go to a classis meeting, because you have a group of people that are deeply inside their culture and their language games. I was in Classis California South yesterday, and there's even a cultural difference between, let's say, my Classis, which is Classis California Central, and Classis California South. So even, and we human beings are so astoundingly subtle when it comes to these different language games. Now again, I know for a lot of people, they'll listen to Jordan Peterson and Matthieu Pageau talk in this video, and it'll sound like gibberish. And I hear that word bandied about sometimes, because this is not my language group. This is not my language game. Others who are deeply nerdy into this little corner of the internet will eat this up. And again, there's a moment in the Thunder Bay. I've just started releasing the Thunder Bay videos a bit at a time, and that's probably how I'll release them. There's another channel out there that will probably release them ahead of mine, Consciousness and Conscience. You can try and find that on YouTube. I put the link in the first video. I think these videos are probably going to go out on all of our channels at some point, and that actually makes sense. You would think that with YouTube, well, if you just put it out on a small channel, then everyone will see them. It's not really the way the algorithm works, and it's not really the way YouTube works. But people listen to this, and it's just, well, this is gibberish, what Jordan is talking about with Matthieu. It doesn't make any sense. And they might think, well, this is sort of like the kind of language you hear from a schizophrenic. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And how do you know whether or not a schizophrenic or someone who is talking like a schizophrenic is speaking the truth or not the truth? We measure it against the world. And so that faith-based axiomatic position that Jordan just talked about in the Douglas Murray conversation, where you test it against the world, is very important. But now that isn't the whole story, because those of you who've been following the sermonic element thread in this channel know that I am in the book of 1 Corinthians. And I preached a sermon at the Thunder Bay Conference. I haven't seen the video for that one yet, and I hope they did record it, because that's a part of this conversation. Because, of course, you have this disconnect between worlds that you find that Paul writes to the church in Corinth. Because the church in Corinth says, we're using this new Jewish, Christian, Jesus, Paul, Apollos, Cephas language to sort of rise in the world, sort of like our natural religion. We're gaining wisdom. And Paul looks at them and says, your religion is fundamentally like the Julian Claudian dynasty that is ruling in Rome. Think Nero. You're still working in the same world and in the same game as Rome is. But the logos of the cross of Christ, the logic of the cross of Christ, the interpretive thread that has been unleashed spiritually in the world by the cross of Christ is already beginning to radically transform the world. And saying that in the 50s, in the first century, is a radical thing to say. Because no one will re-see the cross in a significant way. That impact won't happen for centuries in the Roman world, but it will, to the degree that people nicely walk around with a little gold cross around their neck and say, oh, look at this. Whether, however they stand with respect to Christianity. And so much of this conversation between Jordan and Matthieu Pageau will sort of be lapped up by the nerds of this little corner of the internet, but it will be seen as gibberish to many other people, because we can't help but evaluate this kind of language outside of the mappings that have been put into us and the ways that we're thinking about. But I don't see this conversation as gibberish, which is why I make my videos, because I try to articulate this for a broader audience. And what Jordan has just said is that this book seemingly is so much easier to get through than Jung, but is of a kind similar to what Jung is doing, to try and connect up the world in a different way than most people are used to looking at it. Now, what Matthieu basically says is, this is the way that most people were used to looking at it, but they don't look at it this way anymore. And so this is a lost language. Now, the difficulty with reviving a lost language is we never forget our first language. We don't unthink secularism. We don't unthink evangelical Christendom that Matthieu and Jonathan were brought up in. Jonathan is in Orthodoxy. I don't know Matthieu's situation in terms of any specific religious practice, but he's much more of a programmer, mathematician, and so he says basically, well, this is really this is much more to someone who is dealing in this world. This should make more sense with the pictures. But even though the wall of words is not standing in the way, the basic divisions between people who have mapped on different meaning groups remain standing in the way, and to sort of make your way through a new language group is difficult. And the question of evaluating that new group is also difficult. Now again, this gets into a lot of the work that I've been doing in Sunday sermons. How do we evaluate whether Matthieu Pageau is just an extremely imaginative guy who's making up castles in the air? Because let me tell you something. After having a channel even as small as this one, I regularly run into people who are doing similar things to Matthieu. They are working on the world in the way that Jordan just said, and they are coming up with new languages and new imaginative systems, and in very small places and in small ways, they are proposing that their new language and their new systems get a bigger taking because this helps people live in the world. Now this is part of what has made science so powerful, because science in its way, well, my PC is operating, and I'm old enough to remember DOS before Windows, and then Windows as an overlay on DOS, and you had all the pretty pictures and the icons. And I remember with my first computer, it both had DOS and Windows, and I found myself often just working in DOS in my work because I was developing documents in WordPerfect 5.1 in DOS, but then playing around with Windows. And you could see some of the possibility of Windows, because one of the things you had with Windows was a clipboard. You could kind of do that with DOS, but DOS didn't really have the capacity to take text from WordPerfect and then put it, let's say, into another program, let's say a DOS-based Excel sheet. All of the programs are sort of one at a time in the disk operating system. That's what DOS meant. One at a time in the disk operating system. Then Windows comes around and it has multitasking. So you can have a copy of WordPerfect for Windows and a copy of Excel or Quattro Pro. That was sort of Corel's version of Excel. And you could pass things between them, and you could switch between windows, and you could have two windows up at once. But Windows 3 and then 3.1, it was a little bit buggy. It sort of sat on top of DOS. It would crash, yada, yada, yada. Then you had Windows 95, which was a little bit more stable. And then you had Windows 98, and then you had Windows XP, or Windows ME next, which was, and you always had this sort of one operating system. It had a new capacity, but was it more reliable than the old one? And you sort of had all this thing going on. And then, of course, Windows XP came around, and that was quite a bit more solid. And then Windows has continued to develop today to where it's a very robust operating system, and it seldom crashes. And DOS, the disk operating system, is long forgotten. You've got Unix nerds out there and Linux nerds who are typing code into boxes, and you can still do that with Windows. You can pull up a little command box, and some things are sort of easier to do that if you have all that nerdishness. But all of this is an example of languages and capacity. And in many ways, the challenge of, well, does Matthieu Pageau's system work, or Jordan Peterson's system, or Paul Vanderklay's system, or Sam Harris's system, or all of these systems, and again, they're large and small because all of us have sort of idiosyncratized systems, but we participate in these far larger systems. The challenge with many of these systems are, do they work? And again, that goes back to this little talk that Jordan gives here.
Theistic reality. But then what we've seen happening under the onslaught of postmodernist thought is that we're starting to lose faith in the idea of fact itself. And then I was thinking,
so then, well, if you lose fact, well, how does that sort of pass over to the Windows analogy? Does your computer system work? Well, what do you mean by work? Does it crash? Well, that clearly doesn't work. How do you decide, let's say now, between Windows and Mac OS? Well, now Mac OS has all that nice ARM-based architecture, and so you get long battery life out of your Mac. You have to pay your Apple tax, so you have to pay a little bit more for your Mac. And, well, but you don't necessarily have all the applications in Mac that you do have in Windows. For example, I use Bandicoot very regularly for piecing together these videos, and part of me looks at a MacBook Pro or even a MacBook Air, very nice light little machine, and think that would be very nice, but the way I do my videos, I want to use Bandicoot, and I'm not going to make my videos without it. And so I stick in Windows land. And well, Intel's trying to catch up, but all this x86 architecture isn't anywhere near as efficient as the much newer ARM ARM chips and that they run. It's ARM chips that are running in your phone. They can be quite a bit more energy efficient, and so you've got all of this complexity. So what works now? If we say someone like Elon Musk. Elon Musk has status with many people, not everyone obviously, with many people because he's got a lot of money. And he's done an astounding thing, which is break into the American automobile market. That is not a small thing. If you had 15 years ago, if you had said, can someone break into the American automobile market with an electric car, people would say no. But he has done it. And he's got ideas, he's got a space agency. Or he's got a space organization, a space business, and he's got his boring, and he's got all these things. And so Elon Musk has status. And when people listen to Elon Musk because he has wealth, he has power, he has fame. Now, there's a lot of Elon skeptics out there that think he's a little crazy, but you look at someone's whole life. Now, let's say maybe you look at Warren Buffett and you compare, say, Warren Buffett to Elon Musk. You look at Warren Buffett and you say, well, Warren Buffett is also a smart man. He's made a lot of decisions, but it's in a different realm. And Warren Buffett has been married to the same wife for a very long time and lives in the same humble home for a very long time. And so you look at Warren Buffett and you try to evaluate his operating system, his religion of the world, compared to that of Elon Musk. And so you evaluate. Now, here we have Jordan Peterson. Now, again, one of the really key, I gotta do my homework on my clip channel so I can just pull these clips up right away.
Consistent pattern that we would see across disciplines where the people that the general public and maybe undergrad students would consider as greats aren't. I think generally when you look closely at different disciplines, it looks like there are a few brilliant original minds that are coming up with original concepts, doing interesting work.
And so those are the languages, in a sense. Those are the theories. Those are the ideas, and they're putting it out there. And some of them get traction and they get popular and they go up. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily right. Thomas Kuhn gets mentioned in the Jordan Matthieu conversation because Kuhn makes the point that all of this it's not just sort of in a monarchical vision, sort of the best science wins. No, it's way more complex than that because sociology is at play and some ideas rise and fall, and it's an extremely dynamic situation that science is not sort of this ongoing trudge towards greater information that suddenly wins. Science doesn't work that way at all.
And then there is another type of mind, which is the articulator, somebody that can skillfully talk about the concepts, do a interview for PBS that becomes that gets the cultural designation of this here as an intellectual. And
okay, so they've risen in status in society, which sort of tests it, but you've got fashion and you've got cool and, Elon Musk, he has cachet, and Warren Buffett, he has cachet, but they've got cachets in very different communities.
And then problems are caused from that moment, because what happens is, like, there is a complex social phenomenon that happens where people will start to take sides. And now,
so I'm a Warren Buffett guy, or I'm an Elon Musk guy, or I'm a Jeff Bezos guy, or I'm a Bill Gates guy, or I'm a Jordan Peterson guy, and then suddenly you get all this polarization.
it's now there are going to be, it seems to be within academia as well. There are going to be defenders of the personality and critics of the personality, and then very shortly, it is difficult to carefully reason through ideas because people start playing a social game. And now, I mean, the COVID stuff was
And people are always playing a social game. That's Thomas Kuhn's point. But it isn't merely a social game. If it was merely a social game, then none of this would ever amount to anything. So there's a social game aspect to it, and there is a testing with the world aspect to it, and there's all of this. And so for Matthieu Pageau to again bring to the fore archaic ways of engaging with the world and symbolizing the world and doing all of this in the world, well, we have to evaluate it. But we know Elon Musk, we know Warren Buffett, we know Bill Gates, Windows works. Matthieu Pageau, should we listen to him? How do we evaluate it? The evaluation of it itself is a very big deal. Now Peterson just mentioned names that have, well, controversy certainly, but considerable fame and respect. Jung and Eliade and Newman, and you can go with your religious communities. You have all of these. I mean, and so they are dead men who are well known, and their works have been studied and evaluated. And he says, well, now we've got this book, and this book is different. But again, I think that doesn't mean it's not going to be hard for people to sort of get their minds around it and to do the far harder thing of evaluating it. Now, part of what we do so Jordan has spent a lot of time lately. He's no longer in a rather dirty V-neck undershirt in his office, pleading his screeds out to the world and calling in Julian to help him with his PC. Now here's a living room, and it's all in order, and he's dressed in a good suit, and his hair and everything is, and the Daily Wire team can come in and have good cameras and have the sound right. And on one hand, I surely appreciate that, because I've certainly made and been subjected many of you to all sorts of bad audio on the internet. But now this is a different thing, and all of those things matter. And here we've got Matthieu, and it's like, well, how are we supposed to evaluate this? Now this is a very natural and a very ancient thing. And this actually comes down into Christianity, because the temptations of the devil for Jesus were all about these kinds of issues. Throw yourself from the pinnacle of the temple and let you be seen with angels catching you in front of the religious authorities of your day, and that would then mark and give all of your words authority. It's a really dramatic thing that you don't find hardly anybody knowing who Jesus is until a very long time after Jesus died, resurrects, and ascends. But then when Jesus comes into the scene, he's absolutely going to steamroll the world. That's a very interesting thing. Now, the people around, the Gospels are not very late. They were written fairly early, and Paul's writings are written very early, in the 50s. And so there's a lot going on there, but Jesus did not come out of the sky in a chariot of fire like golden Apollo. Jesus comes born, laid in a manger, because there's no room in the inn. And so now let's imagine if Matthieu Pageau had the good looks of Brad Pitt, the money of Elon Musk, the reputation of Warren Buffett. People would evaluate his mappings of the world and his language of the world based on that success. And this is why in my videos on 1 Corinthians, I talk about nature religion, because basically, if you say you have a handle on the way the world works, your life should show it dramatically. Now, I'm not critiquing or poking at Matthieu Pageau at all in this. That's not my intent at all, because the point is, none of us know him. But we evaluate people by their reputations and by how we know them. And again, in Christianity, he could be a nobody and have everything right. That happens all the time. You didn't always know who Bill Gates was. You didn't always know who Elon Musk was. You didn't always know who Warren Buffett is. And right now, there are people who are laboring in obscurity. Think about J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling bursts onto the scene and changes the world. And so that happens. And like I said, I get letters and emails and have conversations with some of you who are working on your, and in fact, the Randall's conversations have plenty of evidence of that. You're working on your own little language and schemes of the world, and God bless you. Please do keep at it, because you may be right and we all may be wrong, and you might be the next J.K. Rowlings. We don't know, or Matthieu Pageau or Jordan Peterson. We don't know. But in order to evaluate these things, it's a very difficult thing indeed. And we do look at all the different signals. And a little bit later in this conversation, when they ask the question, well, how do we know that all of this symbolism isn't simply arbitrary? It's because we and this is the kicker, over long periods of time, which isn't very easy for us, we hopefully have better ideas emerge and less worthy ideas go and die. And Peterson will again quote Alfred North Whitehead in this about, we have our ideas die so we don't have to. But part of the difficulty of living as human beings in this world is these things take in a tremendous long amount of time, and we live only short-lived lives. And this is why you have the Lindy effect from Nassim Taleb, that very old things ought to be paid attention to because they have endured. And it says something about their truthfulness. That doesn't mean that old lies can't endure, or old BSings can't endure. They do too. But it's part of the package of evaluating this. And part of what is going to be the challenge of this video is, Jonathan Pageau, we know. Matthieu, who are you? You wrote the book, but we haven't seen much of you. And people are going to wonder about that. And this whole dynamic that Stephen Patterson very well articulated here is going on with respect to Jordan. Jordan's a grifter. Jordan's mentally ill. You see it all the time on Twitter. Twitter is sort of the ongoing display of the anxieties and cheap shots of the world. That's what happens on Twitter. But if you actually want to sort of work through and find the truth, but you have a short little life. Do you have time for this? And, I take my time for it, and that says something about me, that I think there's stuff here. And I think Jordan still has stuff to say, because the little video clip, he articulated that in a really important way that surfaced the religious axiomatic nature of modern science. Now, I've got books in my library that have been doing that for years, a lot of them from Dutch Calvinist theology, because Dutch Calvinists have been making similar points to this. But we tend to really base our lives off of social signals. Elon has a lot of money. Elon is famous. Warren Buffett has a lot of money. Warren Buffett is famous. On and on and on and on. Who's the name of the guy who predicted the 2008 stock market crash that they made a movie about? And what was the actor that played him? He's not as famous as Warren Buffett. A bunch of you can write his name in the comment section. I know you can. And you can write the name of the movie, and you can write the name of the book that the movie was based on. And there's all of these levels of this. But the question is, not only, and this is what makes these conversations so difficult, not only are we looking at for the systems that are actually true, and we're so bad at this, which is what John Vervaeke talks about the self-destructive, self-deceptive ways that our relevance realization sifts through the world as we go, getting lots of things wrong. How can we know? Because it's not only the case that our ways that we try to evaluate are limited and messed up and biased. Biases are, of course, the dark side of relevance realization. It's the same thing. But the values that we are pursuing are also in play. And what tends to happen in our culture is we look at all of this instrumentalism. Well, if I can seem to reduce a particular disease that is a novel virus that is rapidly spreading through my culture with this particular solution, well, that can really be a good thing. Well, it depends. Is the solution, now notice the pairing that the drug industry evaluates. Is it safe and effective? Because it might be effective, but if it kills you, yeah, a sharpened axe can end COVID in your body. Not exactly safe. Or acetaminophen, just having gotten through COVID myself, taking some Tylenol will make me feel better from my virus. When I was in the Dominican Republic, often many of these poor Haitians, if they got sick enough to actually go to a doctor, they would go to the doctor, and the doctor would give them 3 or 4 prescriptions. And then they would go to the pharmacy and they would buy, because they didn't have much money, they would buy the cheapest drug, which was usually generic Tylenol. And they would take that and they would feel better and they would die. Because the drug was safe, it was effective for a particular diagnosis, but it didn't cure the disease. And so the difficulty that we have is not only do we have questions about what is effective in terms of pursuing what we want, we have difficulties of not knowing the good that we pursue. And what we do as a society right now is we're always looking for the effective, but the values are sort of masked. Because basically, as we've said in many videos, we've just assumed all of these Christian values and we've taken them away from Christendom, which is exactly why Tom Holland's book Dominion is so important. And we begin to recognize, oh my goodness, those values I get from Jesus. That's the logos of the cross of Christ rather than the logos of the cross of Rome. That's the logic of the cross of Christ rather than the logic of the cross of Rome. And this stuff is so deep in us, we just feel it. We don't reason our way to it from first principles. It's just self-evident to us. That's what all these conversations are about. And so now we have Matthieu Pageau, at least with Douglas Murray and Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson. Well, they're sort of on our radar screens. But this guy, wow. And he hasn't had hundreds of hours of working on talking about this publicly like some of the rest of us have. So, but what that means is that a lot of people are not going to watch this or simply going to dismiss it. But the reason why some of you will watch it is because by reputation, well, he and Jonathan helped put this stuff together. So maybe there's stuff here. And he's going to talk about something that's sort of like fifth rail on the New York subway, which is fifth column, third rail. You got to watch those metaphors. He's going to talk about men and women. And for many people who live in the modernistic, secular context that we live in, this stuff is just sort of dismissed. And it shouldn't be. And will we be able to get some golden nuggets out of this? Yeah, there's some golden nuggets in there. Can we contextualize it in a way that we value?
Work is oddly positioned, in the best sense, on the rational and a propositional side, even though simultaneously it manages to lay out the...
Okay, now, Jordan is speaking well here. It's on the rational and propositional side. Boy, there's so much in the Thunder Bay material that is relevant to this. when we get to the Mandrell, John Vervaeke, why can I remember? I'm just an auditory learner. I remember things that I hear. There's a moment when I go over the tape, we'll see how accurately I remember it, because that isn't always the case. There's the desire that Richard Mandrell and John Vervaeke both talked about. There's the desire to have less propositional religion, or propositional free religion. This book is full of propositions. And part of my argument in this little corner is that you're never going to have a propositionless, proposition-free religion, because it won't be any utility to you, because you are living in a world that's deeply embedded in propositions. Now, John is exactly right in that in the modernist frame, the propositional hand was overplayed. And in some ways it was overplayed in the modernist frame is because it wasn't sufficiently played in the medieval frame, and modern science really got good at propositions. And so what we tend to see in history is just always this continual overplaying, underplaying, overplaying, underplaying. We go back and forth because to actually get the balance right is extremely difficult. And so again, this book is not word heavy like the other books. It's seemingly accessible, but in terms of the application of it, this is where, well, if I apply this book, will it grow hair? Can I get my hair back? Will it, reduce unnecessary fat on my body and help me run 5 miles in less time than I can run now? And will it improve my marriage? Will it help my children do better in school? Will it? Now, you might hear sort of a tongue-in-cheek with respect to that, but these kinds of things are in fact the ways that people evaluate, and rightly so. Because what we're looking for is a way in a very big realm to live better. That's nature religion. To have a better life. But it's also civilizational religion. Now, this is the rough draft that I'll probably release this on Monday. Civilizational religion that says the evaluation is, 1 Corinthians 3, the field. God's field or God's building. It's the civilization that you can evaluate religions not just in terms of what they do right now, but how they compete on the world stage. Now Sam and Tripp, who are known to many of you on this little corner of the internet, had what I thought was a very good conversation. Yeah, Tripp did a lot of talking. Tripp's a talker. But I thought it was a good conversation about the Peterson, Murray, Pageau talk, and gets into David Sloan Wilson.
That Douglas says, like, the preacher's dilemma is outlined by Schopenhauer, right? Like, basically, the preachers, the well-educated clergy, know that this whole thing is baloney, right? At the literal level, perhaps. But yet it has this metaphorical oomph to it, and so they're in charge of continuing to propagate the thing that they interpret as literal baloney but figurative usefulness.
Now, what I think the well-educated clergy know is not that this is baloney, but that you need to have propositions in the world, and that what we're looking at is about the difference between a shortly lived bug and a field that has fed a village for generations. And a shortly lived mason laborer and a cathedral that has been built over hundreds of years to sustain the life of a civilization, so that when Notre Dame catches on fire, it's not the handful of people that might go to worship in Notre Dame Cathedral and say, oh, we're losing the roof over our head where we go to church on Sunday. No, it's an entire civilization saying, we can't lose this building. Well, why? It's because there's all of this scaling up at a size and a degree that we tiny little short-lived people don't really understand, which is why, and Jordan Peterson makes this point very well, you go to the Getty after you get to a certain age to appreciate it, and you look at these paintings and you stop and you think, why am I looking at these paintings? Why are these paintings worth millions of dollars? Why did the artists die poor and hungry? This is us. This is human beings.
And so I had a conversation on my channel with a guy named David Sloan Wilson, who's a evolutionary biologist, and he's like all about group level selection. And he has talked more than almost anyone else, I think, about sort of how to understand religion from a evolutionary standpoint. But even when I was talking to him, he asked me basically the same version of this question. Like, well, how does it feel like you still consider yourself religious? How do you do that if you know that it's all just a human-made thing, right? Like, he thought that his evolutionary explanation of religion explains it away, basically, right? By explaining it through some sort of scientific lens, therefore it's deconstructed, right? And so there's this difference between preacher talk and, like, everyday, like, oh, don't listen to the preacher talk, just listen to, like, just do the ethical ramifications of it. And there's this weird dichotomy between the myth and what it causes you to do, and what it causes you to do is important.
Yeah. So to me, that sounds,
And again, well, why would you listen to the two of these randos? Well, they're not randos to me. I mean, I've met Sam. I haven't met Tripp in person yet. I've spoken with both of them. They have my esteem. They have my respect. I respect them for their intelligence. I respect them for their education. And they're not randos to me. They might be randos to you, but does that mean they're wrong? And it's all in this sort of civilizational time frame that makes it for each of us tremendously difficult to evaluate.
Symbolic grammar of the entire biblical narrative, and really the entire narrative. And so maybe you can start by introducing some of that. Your book has 6 parts. I'll just go through them, and we'll start with part 1. Part 1 is salvaging creation from the scientific worldview. Part 2 is heaven.
Now, again, someone might say, well, what do you mean salvaging it from the scientific worldview? Didn't science give us electricity and computers and cameras and healthcare? And science has given us a lot, and it has, and we should be grateful. Science, and depending on where you stand, science has also given us environmental problems. Well, we had environmental problems before, but science has given us hosts of problems along with its solutions. Science has given us more power, and with this power, we have done all kinds of heinous things according to our post-Jesus moral frameworks. So there's a whole lot going here. And so
heaven and earth in biblical cosmology. Part 3 is heaven and earth on the human scale. Part 4, time and space in biblical cosmology. Part 5, time and space on the human scale. And then part 6, transcending the scientific worldview. And in part 1...
And so, what's Matthieu trying to do? He's trying to remap us. Actually, what he's trying to do is say, here's an old map that is actually built into the world that you're already living in, most of which has been sort of ignored and forgotten, but there's still stuff in it. And it's sort of like opening up a command line in Windows in front of almost anybody that I would open it up in front of instead of, let's say, Rick. Open up a command line in Windows and people would be like, what's that? What's that little blinking underline thing? And then I can do something like this and suddenly like, oh my. Look at that. Look at what he did. Whoops. Look at what he did. Let's not type that one in. But, yeah. How do I know how to do this? Well, it's because I'm old.
One, you juxtapose the scientific worldview with the biblical worldview and make a strong case, well, I would say for the utility of both, but you make a strong case for the utility of the latter, the biblical narrative, and then attempt to outline what it's attempting to accomplish. And so maybe you could give us a bit of an intro to that.
Yeah, so basically what I was attempting to do in the first part of the book is move away from a materialistic worldview towards an ancient worldview where meaning is at the center of everything. So basically, logos is the driving force of everything. Whereas in a materialistic perspective,
And again, a lot of people, nerds in this little corner of the internet, say, I know exactly what he's saying. A lot of other people be like, I have no idea what he's saying.
it's about, like I explained in my book, it's just about understanding how things work, basically, how things function.
That's religion. How things work, how things function. How do I get my ships over to, get at Paris and Troy, who, they've got Helen, Menelaus's wife, and we've got to go get her. And I'm not getting favorable winds from Poseidon, so, well, I guess I'd better sacrifice my daughter. That's how things work.
And the other perspective is pretty much the opposite of that. And we've completely lost, I think, the other perspective in many ways. So
we don't know how to do that whole command line thing anymore.
It was relegated to the artistic domain. That's basically what happened. So
the command lines don't make pretty art.
It still is out there, but for people who are more rationally minded, it's not satisfactory. To me, it wasn't, at least.
So my brother's an artist. The artists, they're still lapping it up, but for someone who's more on the math programming side, kind of left me cold. So I had to write this thing.
I enjoy a good painting, but my mind is not satisfied with that. I need something more precise and concrete and also usable.
Your work is predicated on the idea that that the act of cognition and perception is a consequence, and correct me if I'm wrong, of something approximating simultaneous top-down and bottom-up processing. And so the top-down processing is something like the imposition of a structure of order on the multiplicity of the world. And that order is implicate, it's intrinsic.
Okay, and that's when we get to, gosh, I gotta get all these videos uploaded so I can access them easily, because Pageau's talk was exactly about this top-down ordering, about seeing, and again, this is pre-conscious, seeing a lens cap, whereas, let's say, someone who grew up in a jungle and had never seen a camera or a lens, or maybe even someone who had just grown up in a modern household and the only camera they've ever known is on their phone. They look at this thing and say, is this a coaster to keep the ring from your cold glass from making a mark on your wood furniture that'll get you yelled at from your mom? This is what we're doing.
Intrinsic to being itself, and it manifests itself to us psychologically and existentially and phenomenologically, let's say, in the sense of meaning that imbues our perceptions.
And again, someone looks at this and says, meaning, they see meaning, they don't see the thing. They say, oh, that's, they've got a cold drink in a glass, and they feel it sweating, and they see the nice wood on the furniture, and they remember doing that and having your mom yell at you, and now you're a guest in a home, and you need something to put this drink on, or you're going to not be a very good guest, and you're going to leave a mark on their furniture. And you see this thing and say, oh, I know what that is. We see meaning. Unless you're, well, you have to move the camera, because this camera that I use for all my film is the same camera we use on Sundays, and I have to move this camera, and if I grab this camera, I've got oil on my skin, and it'll get right on the front of that nice lens, and I don't want that to happen, and other people are going to be handling this camera on Sunday, so I'm going to look for this lens cap, and this isn't a very good coaster. It's got little springy things in it, and come on, lose my face. There you go. It's got little springy things in it, and this is a great lens cap. We see meaning.
And actions if we're acting in proper accordance with the hierarchy. And so for you, there is
and lots of different hierarchies come into play. You've got mom and her hierarchy of not damaging her furniture, and you have dad and his hierarchy of not getting, smudges all on your lens. My father liked playing around with photography, so I learned about smudges from him. And my mother didn't like little rings on her wooden furniture, so I learned about coasters from her. And this, well, is a lens cap.
There's a pyramid of perception and action. The top of the pyramid is associated with heaven, symbolically and cognitively, and the bottom of the pyramid with the multiplicity of earth. And the heavenly domain is the pinnacle, but also a spirit that saturates the entire hierarchy. And it's a spirit of unity and order, and the order that is good. And it's also reflective of the implicate order. And so that would be the logos of the world. Does that seem approximately correct?
Yes, exactly. The idea is kind of like in mathematics. You have some first principles, and then everything comes from the meaning that's implicit in the first principles. So, you have some axioms that seem like they don't contain a lot of information, but when you unpack them, you end up explaining a lot of phenomenon. And part of it also is it becomes your lens to view reality. So it's always incomplete in a sense, but it provides reason for things, order for things, purpose. So,
and now the fact that there are different lenses means different lenses reveal and obscure different things.
It's unlike science, which claims to just be about discovering the laws of nature. It also has a purpose. It imposes a purpose on reality. It doesn't just claim to...
How I see this lens cap coaster imposes a purpose on reality. It might be the purpose to make sure I have a clean lens so that you see my beard in all of its glory. Or I have furniture without these little damaging wet rings on them, that even if you spent a lot of money for that tabletop, and if those rings get in there, they're not going anywhere.
Explained phenomenon. There's a difference.
Well, and the thing that I think is so relevant in all of that, the prime issue of relevance, is the issue of what John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist, has been calling relevance realization. We have the problem of what to focus our attention on. And that's actually an unbelievably pervasive problem, and a deep problem, because there's an infinite multiplicity of phenomena that we could attend to, and combinations of phenomena that we could attend to, in such massive numbers that it's very difficult to understand how we don't become overwhelmed. And the way we don't become overwhelmed is that we impose something like a point on things. And a point is the point of our perceptions and the point of our actions. And the point, in the ultimate sense, is also the ultimate thing towards which we're striving. And that ultimate thing towards which we're striving is, as far as I can tell, elucidated in no small part in the biblical cosmology, because it's an attempt to lay out the characteristics.
These books, these stories, these mappings, these shape us before we're cognizant of them, before we're aware of them. Oh, someone just ran over. I'm driving through the boonies of the Dominican Republic in a Jeep full of pastors going down this coastal highway. Beautiful, beautiful coastal highway. Nissan Patrol. Swear that truck could climb trees. Big, huge wheels, climb on anything, an old truck. Drive, flying along this highway, wheels making a lot of noise. Dog runs out, bang. I hit the dog. What am I going to do? I'm going to stop. Why am I going to stop? It could be somebody's pet. It could be, So I'm ready to pull off to the side of the road and find this dog and find its owner and maybe make restitution or do something. The pastors look at me like I have 3 heads. I said, I just hit a dog. And they said, yeah, you just hit a dog. Keep driving. Well, what do you mean? It's a dog. Are dogs different in the Dominican Republic than here? Here's a picture my father took of a dog in the Dominican Republic. Dogs are just kind of always skirting around, and someone drops a little food. I mean, dogs are kicked, dogs are abused, dogs not a valued animal. Pastors are like, it's a dog. It's like, yeah, but it's a dog. I'm an American. I love dogs. This is a dog too. Look at, we put a sweater on him. We have him in our lap. We spend all kinds of money to try to keep the darn thing healthy. When in the Dominican Republic, you almost have to hit him with a Jeep to kill him. And, well, so what is a dog?
Of the spirit that would orient us towards the highest good as we go about our job of perceiving the complex world and acting in it. And so, I mean, part of the revolutionary element of your thinking is that even our confrontation with the material world per se, and our ability to derive the facts upon which a materialist worldview is hypothetically based, is dependent on an ethic of perceptual prioritization and action that's described in the biblical cosmology and in mythic narratives in general. And so it's a priori. It exists prior to the act of perception that even enables us to make contact with the material world.
Yes, exactly.
And this is why, again, my illustration, I walk in. Now, really, if the Queen of England is sitting in my office chair, she's really going to have my attention. Or a Bengal tiger, or a cobra, instead of the multiplicity. So today we had the fire inspector. We have our yearly annual inspection here at the church from the fire department, and the fire inspector comes in my office, and my office is a mess. But what does the fire inspector look for? Extension cords on the floor underneath the carpet. Well, my extension cords are on top of the carpet, and the extension cord is plugged into the fan that's blowing at me right now. And he looks at this and says, well, what about this? I says, I blow the fan on me to keep me cool when I'm making videos. Oh, okay. Well, then that's okay because it's something that's temporary. Well, does it blow on you to keep you cool or on the equipment to keep it cool? And the fireplace is thinking, how hot is this equipment you have in your office? No, it's not very hot. My Windows computer is not very hot, and this little light I have here is not very hot, and this little monitor is not very hot. I make the most heat, so it keeps me cool.
We have some spiritual principles that we're often not aware of. And then the reason we're not aware of them is because they're extremely simple. So sometimes we can't see things because they're too complex and they appear to us as darkness or clouds. But when things are too simple, we also don't see them for a different reason. It's like they're transparent. we don't even see their existence.
Simple, I don't think, is the right word. They're too foundational. We don't see it because it's beneath the waterline or it's beneath the earth.
Basically.
Those seem to me to be the axioms upon which our perceptions are founded, and they're implicit, right? So they're part of the structure through which we actually view the world. I'm going to read.
Now, I want to connect this. Boy, do I have the... Shall I do this today? Because this is going to be a big, time-consuming section. A real struggle for modern audiences is to understand the narrative and the symbolic and just how foundational that is to many of the ways that we approach the world. I want to use a chapter in Irvin Yalom's Love's Executioner. Now, Irvin Yalom is not a fringe figure. He taught psychology at Stanford University for most of his career, and he is one of the most renowned psychologists in 20th century history. He wrote books which were stories which illustrated the power of his labor and just how good a psychologist he was. And I recently listened to this chapter, and it amazingly illustrates this idea of narrative and story, at least representation of much deeper things below the surface that are effective in helping to straighten out someone's world.
Chapter 10, In Search of the Dreamer. Sex is at the root of everything. Isn't that what you fellows say? Well, in my case, you may be right. Take a look at this. It'll show you some interesting connections between my migraines and my sex life. Drawing a thick scroll from his briefcase, Marvin asked me to hold one end and carefully unrolled a 3-foot chart upon which was meticulously recorded every migraine headache and every sexual experience of the past 4 months. One glance revealed the complexity of the diagram. Every migraine, its intensity, duration, and treatment was coded in blue. Every sexual rush, coded red, was reduced to a 5-point scale according to Marvin's performance. Premature ejaculations were separately coded, as was impotence, with a distinction made between inability to sustain an erection and inability to have one. It was too much to absorb in a glance. That's an elaborate piece of work, I said. It must have taken you days. I like doing it. I'm good at it. People forget that we accountants have graphic skills that are never used in tax work. Here, look at the month of July. 4 migraines, and each one preceded by either impotence or a grade 1 or 2 sexual performance. I watched Marvin's finger point to the blips of migraine and impotence. He was right. The correlation was impressive, but it was growing edgy. My timing had been thrown off. We had only just begun our first session, and there was much more I wanted to know before I would feel ready to examine Marvin's chart. But he pressed it before me so forcefully that I had no option other than to watch his stubby finger trace out the love leavings of last July. Marvin at 64 had suddenly, 6 months ago, for the first time in his life, developed disabling migraine headaches. He had consulted a neurologist who had been unsuccessful in controlling Marvin's headaches, and then referred him to me. I had seen Marvin for the first time only a few minutes earlier when I went out to my waiting room to fetch him. He was sitting there patiently, a short, chubby, bald man with a glistening pate and owl eyes which never blinked as they peered through oversized, gleaming chrome spectacles. I was soon to learn that Marvin was particularly interested in spectacles. After shaking hands with me, his first words while accompanying me down the hall to my office were to compliment me on my frames and to ask me their make. I believe I fell from grace when I confessed ignorance of the manufacturer's name. Things grew even more awkward when I removed my glasses to read the brand name on the stem and found that, without my glasses, I could not read it. It did not take me long to realize that since my other glasses were now resting at home, there was no way that I could give Marvin the trivial information he desired, so I held out my spectacles for him to read the label. Alas, he too was nearsighted, and more of our first minutes together was consumed by his switching to his reading glasses. And now, a few minutes later, before I could proceed to interview him in my customary way, I found myself surrounded by Marvin's meticulous red and blue penciled chart. No, we were not off to a good start. To compound the problem, I had just had a poignant but exhausting session with an elderly, distraught widow whose purse had recently been stolen. Part of my attention was still with her, and I had to spur myself to give Marvin the attention he deserved. Having received only a brief consultation note from the neurologist, I knew practically nothing about Marvin, and began the hour, after we completed the opening eyeglass ritual, by asking, "What ails?" That was when he volunteered that you fellows think sex is at the root of everything. I rolled up the chart, told Marvin I'd like to study it in detail later, and attempted to restore some rhythm to the session by asking him to tell me the whole story of his illness from the beginning. He told me that about 6 months ago.
Now, this starts out to be just a weird story about what seems like a weird guy who is keeping a weird chart about his sex life. And he's an accountant. And so he's evaluating his performance, and it just starts out bizarre.
He, for the first time in his life, began suffering from headaches. The symptoms were those of classical migraine. A premonitory visual aura, flashing lights, and a unilateral distribution of excruciating pain which incapacitated him for hours and often necessitated bed rest in a darkened room. And you say you have good reason to believe that your sexual performance touches off the migraine. You may think it's strange for a man of my age and position, but you can't dispute the facts. There's the proof. He pointed to the scroll, now resting quietly on my desk. Every migraine of the last 4 months was preceded within 24 hours by a sexual failure. Marvin spoke in a deliberate, pedantic manner. Obviously, he had rehearsed this material beforehand. For the last year, I have been having violent mood swings. I pass quickly from feeling good to feeling that it's the end of the world. Now, don't jump to conclusions. Here he shook his finger at me for greater emphasis. When I say I feel good, I do not mean I'm manic. I've been down that road with the neurologists who tried to treat me for manic depressive disease with lithium. Didn't do a thing except screw up my kidneys. I can see why docs get sued. Have you ever seen a case of manic depression starting at 64? Do you think I should have gotten lithium?
Now, what's fun here, too, is that as a materialist, you might say, well, your impotence and your headaches, these must have biological causes. These couldn't have narratively based causes. Now, part of the reason I played so much about Japan and China the other day is because we know we have narrative causes. Narratives cause our wars. Narratives cause our feelings. Narratives are all over the place. Now, this guy is having some physiological symptoms. Can they be narratively based? And at what level might they be narratively based? They might be at a level of narrative that is unconscious for him.
His questions jarred me. They were distracting, and I didn't know how to answer them. Was he suing the neurologist? I didn't want to get involved with that. Too many things to deal with. I made an appeal to efficiency. I'd be glad to come back to these questions later, but we can make best use of our time today if we first hear your whole clinical story straight through. Right you are. All right, let's stay on track. So as I was saying, I flip back and forth from feeling good to feeling anxious and depressed, both together. And it is always in the depressed states that the headaches occur. I never had one till 6 months ago. And the link between sex and depression? I was getting to that. Careful, I thought. My impatience is showing. It's clear he's going to tell it his way, not mine. For Christ's sake.
Now, and because of the way this thing surfaced, kinds of questions. How many women is he having sex with? Is this guy like a lounge lizard who's picking up women all over the place? And I mean, and this is sort of how life sort of unfolds before you. Is we know very little about the man, but you know, sort of what we don't know about him is sort of in the cloud of war, the cloud of narrative blankness.
Stop pushing him. Well, this is the part you'll find hard to believe. For the last 12 months, my mood swings have been totally controlled by sex. If I have good sex with my wife, the world seems bright. If not, bingo, depression and headaches. Tell me about your depressions. What are they like? Like an ordinary depression. I'm down. Say some more. What's
the dude's obviously not terribly loquacious. Depression, I'm down. Bang, he's accountant. It's just black and white. It's just facts. It's just numbers. It's charts. It's scales. Something's wrong. Maybe you can help me. Probably not.
To say everything looks black. What do you think about in the depressions? Nothing. That's the problem. Isn't that what depression's all about? Sometimes when people get depressed, certain thoughts circle around in their mind. I keep knocking myself. How? I start to feel that I will always fail in sex, that my life as a man is over. Once the depression sets in, I'm bound to have a migraine within the next 24 hours. Other doctors have told me that I am in a vicious circle. Let's see, how does it work? When I'm depressed, I get impotent, and then because I'm impotent, I get more depressed. Yep, that's it. But knowing that doesn't stop it, doesn't break the vicious circle. What does break it? You'd think after 6 months I'd know the answer. I'm pretty observant, always have been. That's what good accountants get paid for, but I'm not sure. One day I have good sex and everything's all right again. Why that day and not another day? I haven't a clue. And so the hour went. Marvin's commentary was precise but stingy, slightly abrasive and larded with cliches, questions, and the comments of other doctors. He remained remarkably clinical. Although he brought up details of his sexual life, he expressed no embarrassment, self-consciousness, or for that matter, any deeper feelings. At one point, I tried to get beneath the forced, hail fellow heartiness. Marvin, it must not be easy for you to talk about intimate aspects of your life to a stranger. You mentioned you had never talked to a psychiatrist before. It's not a matter of things being intimate. It's more to do with psychiatry. I don't believe in psychiatrists. You don't believe we exist? A stupid attempt at a feeble joke, but Marvin did not note my tongue-in-cheek. No, it's not that. It's that I don't have faith in them. My wife Phyllis doesn't either. We've known two couples with marital problems who saw psychiatrists and both ended up in divorce court. You can't blame me for being on guard, can you? By the end of the hour, I was not able to make a recommendation and scheduled a second consultation hour. We shook hands, and as he left my office, I became aware that I was glad to see him go. I was sorry I had to see him again. I was irritated with Marvin, but why? Was it his superficiality, his needling, his wagging his finger at me, his you fellows tone? Was it his innuendos about suing his neurologist and trying to draw me into it? Was it that he was so controlling? He took over the hour, first with the silly business of the glasses and then with his determination to stick that chart in my hands whether I wanted it or not. I thought of tearing that chart in shreds and enjoying every moment of it. But so much irritation. So Marvin disrupted the pace of the hour. So what? He was up front. He told me exactly what was troubling him as best he could. He had worked hard according to his conception of psychiatry. His chart was, after all, useful. I would have been pleased with it had it been my idea. Perhaps it was more my problem than his. Had I grown so stodgy, so old? Was I so rigid in such a rut that it...
Part of what's fun about Yalom is that he's introspective. He notes that it's not just the patient that's in the room. He's not sitting on some scientific chair with a monarchical vision looking down at the guy. They're both, as Matthieu Pageau will say, they're both moving.
If the first hour didn't proceed just the way I wished it to, I grew cranky and stomped my feet. Driving home that evening, I thought more about him. The two Marvins, Marvin the man, Marvin the idea. It was the flesh and blood Marvin who was irritating and uninteresting, but Marvin the project was intriguing. Think of that extraordinary story. For the first time in his life, a stable, if prosaic, previously healthy 64-year-old man who has been having sex with the same woman for 41 years suddenly becomes exquisitely sensitive to his sexual performance. His entire well-being soon becomes hostage to sexual functioning. The event is severe. His migraines are exceptionally disabling. It is unexpected. Sex never presented any unusual problems previously, and it is sudden. It erupted in full force precisely 6 months ago.
Now we have something interesting. And is this a biological issue? Is this a narrative issue?
6 months ago. Obviously, there lay the key, and I began the second session by exploring the events of 6 months ago. What changes in his life had occurred then? Nothing of significance, Marvin said. Impossible, I insisted, and posed the same question many different ways. I finally learned that 6 months ago, Marvin had made the decision to retire and sell his accountancy firm. The information emerged slowly, not because he was unwilling to tell me about retirement, but because he attached little importance to the event. I felt otherwise. The markers of one's life stages are always significant, and few markers more so than retirement. How is it possible for retirement not to evoke deep feelings about the passage and passing of life, about the meaning and significance of one's entire life project? For those who look inward, retirement is a time of life review, of summing up, a time of proliferating awareness, of finitude in approaching death. Not so for Marvin.
Now again, you've got the relationship between the narrative and the physiological in this case.
Problems about retiring, you got to be kidding. This is what I've been working for, so I can retire. Will you find yourself missing anything about your work? Only the headaches, and I guess you can say I've found a way to take them with me. The migraines, I mean. Marvin grinned, obviously pleased with himself for having stumbled upon a joke. Seriously, I've been tired and bored with my work for years. What do you think I'll miss? The new tax forms? Sometimes retirement stirs up important feelings because it is such an important milestone in life. It reminds us of life passages. You've been working for how long? 45 years? And now you suddenly stop. You pass on to a new stage. When I retire, I think it will bring home to me more clearly than I've ever known that life has a beginning and an end. That I've been slowly passing from one point to another, and that I am now approaching the end. My work is about money. That's the name of the game. What retirement really means is that I've made so much money, I don't need to make any more. What's the point of it? I can live in my interests very comfortably. But Marvin, what will it mean not to work again? All your life you've worked. You've gotten your meaning out of working. I have a hunch there's something scary about giving it up. Who needs it? Now, some of my associates are killing themselves piling up enough money so they can live on their interest's interest. That's what I call crazy. They should see a psychiatrist. Verboridin. We talked past each other. Again and again, I invited Marvin to look within, to adopt even for a moment a cosmic perspective, to identify the deeper concerns of his existence, his sense of finitude, of aging and decline, his fear of death, his source of life purpose. But we talked past each other. He ignored me, misunderstood me. He seemed pasted to the surface of things, weary of traveling alone on these little subterranean...
Okay, talked past each other. Pasted to the surface of things. Notice how those metaphors are so obvious to us, but what do you mean past? They're sitting in a room just like they were. Surface of what? We know what a surface is. It's where you put a coaster.
excursions, I decided to stay closer to Marvin's concerns. We talked about work. I learned that when he was very young, his parents and some teachers had considered him a math prodigy. At the age of 8, he had auditioned unsuccessfully for the Quiz Kids radio show, but he never lived up to the early billing. I thought he sighed when he said this and asked, "That must have been a big wound for you. How well did it heal?" He suggested that perhaps I was too young to appreciate how many 8-year-old boys auditioned unsuccessfully for the Quiz Kids. Feelings don't always follow rational rules. In fact, usually they don't. If I would have given in to feelings every time I was hurt, I'd never have gotten anywhere. I noticed that it's very hard for you to talk about wounds. I was one of hundreds. It was no big deal. I noticed, too, that whenever I try to move closer to you, you let me know you don't need anything. I'm here for help. I'll answer all your questions. It was clear that a direct appeal would be of no value. It was going to take Marvin a long time to share his vulnerability. I retreated to fact-gathering. Marvin grew up in New York, the only child of impoverished first-generation Jewish parents. He majored in mathematics at a small city college and briefly considered graduate school. But he was impatient to get married. He had dated Phyllis since he was 15, and since he had no financial resources, decided to become a high school teacher. After 6 years of teaching trigonometry, Marvin felt stuck. He arrived at the conclusion that getting rich was what life was all about. The idea of 35 more years of slender high school teacher paychecks was unbearable. He was certain the decision to teach school had been a serious mistake, and at the age of 30, set about rectifying it. After a crash accountancy course, he said goodbye to his students and colleagues and opened an accounting firm, which ultimately proved to be highly lucrative. With wise investments in California real estate, he had become a wealthy man. That brings us up to now, Marvin. Where do you go in life from here? Well, as I said, there's no point in accumulating any more money. I have no children. Here his voice turned gray. No poor relatives, no desires to give it to good causes. You sounded sad when you talked about not having children. That's past history. I was disappointed then, but that was a long time ago, 35 years ago. I have a lot of plans. I want to travel. I want to add to my collections. Maybe they're my substitute for children. Stamps, political campaign buttons, old baseball uniforms, and Reader's Digest. Next, I explored Marvin's relationship with his wife, which he insisted was extremely harmonious. After 41 years, I still feel my wife is a great lady. I don't like being away from her, even for one night. In fact, I feel warm inside when I see her at the end of the day. All my tension disappears. Perhaps you could say she's my Valium. According to Marvin, their sex life had been wonderful until 6 months ago. Despite 41 years, it seemed to have retained luster and passion. When Marvin's periodic impotence began, Phyllis had at first shown great understanding and patience. But during the last couple of months, had become irritable. Only a couple of weeks ago, she had grumbled that she was tired of being had, that is, being sexually aroused, and then left unsatisfied. Marvin gave great weight to Phyllis's feelings and was deeply troubled when he thought he had displeased her. He brooded for days after an episode of impotence and was entirely dependent upon her to regain his equilibrium. Sometimes she brought him around simply by reassuring him that she still found him virile, but generally he required some physical comforting. She lathered him in the shower, she shaved him, she massaged him. She took his soft penis into her mouth and held it there gently until it throbbed into life. I was struck in the second interview, as in the first, by Marvin's lack of wonderment at his own story. Where was his curiosity that his life had changed so dramatically that his sense of direction, his happiness, even his desire to live was now entirely dictated by whether he could sustain 2 missions in his penis? It was time now to make a recommendation to Marvin about treatment. I did not think he would be a good candidate for a deep, uncovering type of psychotherapy. There were several reasons. I've always found it difficult to treat someone with so little curiosity. Although it is possible to assist in the unfolding of curiosity, the subtle and...
Now this is key here in this story, that, well, psychotherapy, probably not. Why? Looks into the guy. This guy's got no curiosity about himself. He doesn't believe in any of this. He himself is all on the surface. And so, not a good candidate for psychotherapy.
lengthy process would be incompatible with Marvin's wish for a brief and efficient treatment. As I thought back over the 2 hours, I was also aware that he had resisted every one of my invitations to dip deeper into his feelings. He didn't seem to understand. We talked past each other. He had no interest in the inner meaning of events. He also resisted my attempts to engage.
The inner meaning of events. Where would that inner meaning be? What would that inner meaning be?
Him more personally and directly. For example, when I had asked him about his wound or pointed out that he ignored any of my attempts to get closer to him. I was about to offer my formal recommendation that he begin a course of behavioral therapy, an approach based on changing concrete aspects of behavior, especially marital communication and sexual attitudes and practice, when, almost as an afterthought, Marvin mentioned that he had some dreams during the week. I had inquired about dreams during the first interview, and like many other patients, he replied that though he dreamed every night, he could not recall the details of a single dream. I had suggested he keep a writing pad by his bed to record dreams, but he seemed so little inner-directed that I doubted he would follow through, and I neglected to inquire about them in the second session.
Dreams. Oh, well, now we're barking up the psychiatrist's door, aren't we? This is Jung and Freud and these dreams, these strange little chaotic stories that seem to go through our head every night that come from where we think we maybe might know and go to, well, we don't really know because they're not that important. Dreams.
Now he took out his notepad and began to read a series of dreams. Phyllis was distraught that she hadn't been good to me. She left to go home, but when I followed her there, she was gone. I was afraid I would find her dead in this large castle on a high mountain. Next, I was trying to get into the window of a room where her body might be. I was on a high, narrow ledge. I couldn't go any farther, but it was too narrow to turn around and go back. I was afraid that I'd fall, and then I grew afraid that I'd jump and commit suicide. Phyllis and I were undressing to make love. Wentworth, a partner of mine who weighs 250 pounds, was in the room. His mother was outside. We had to blindfold him so we could continue. When I went outside, I didn't know what to say.
Don't you love dreams?
To his mother about why we blindfolded him. There was a gypsy camp forming right in the front lobby of my office. All of them were filthy dirty, their hands, their clothes, the bags they were carrying. I heard the men whispering and conspiring in a menacing way. I wondered why the authorities would permit them to camp out in the open. The ground under my house was liquefying. I had a giant auger and knew that I would have to drill down 65 feet to save the house. I had hit a layer of solid rock and the vibrations woke me up. Remarkable dreams.
Okay. What does Yalom see that maybe you and I didn't see? Well, maybe he's got all these crazy ideas about that dreams mean something, that somehow these dreams are keys to unlocking what? The guy has impotence. He has migraines. Shouldn't you send him to a medical doctor to give him drugs?
Where had they come from? Could Marvin have possibly dreamed them? I looked up, half expecting to see someone else sitting across from me. But he was still there, patiently awaiting my next question, his eyes blank behind his gleaming spectacles. We had only a few minutes left. I asked Marvin whether he had any associations to any aspect of these dreams. He merely shrugged. They were a mystery to him. I had asked for dreams, and he had given them to me. That was the end of it. The dreams notwithstanding, I proceeded to recommend a course of marital therapy, perhaps 8 to 12 sessions. I suggested several options, to see the two of them myself, to refer them to someone else, or to refer Phyllis to a female therapist for a couple of sessions, and then for the four of us, Phyllis, Marvin, I, and her therapist, to meet in conjoined sessions. Marvin listened attentively to what I said, but his facial expression was so frozen that I had no hint of what he felt. When I asked for his reaction, he became strangely formal and said, "I'll take your suggestions under consideration and let you know my decision." Was he disappointed? Did he feel rejected? I couldn't be sure. It seemed to me at the time that I had made the right recommendation. Marvin's dysfunction was acute and would respond, I thought, to a brief cognitive behavioral approach. Furthermore, I was convinced he would not profit from individual therapy. Everything weighed against it. He was too resistant. In the trade language, he simply had too little psychological mindedness. Nonetheless, it was with regret that I passed up the opportunity of working in depth with him. The dynamics of his situation fascinated me. I was certain that my first impression had been close to the mark, that his impending retirement had stoked up much fundamental activity about finitude, aging, and death, and that he was attempting to cope with his anxiety through sexual mastery. So much was riding on the sexual act that it was overtaxed and ultimately overwhelmed.
Okay, so a narrative. Again, a narrative problem is at the heart of his dysfunction in bed with his wife, who he's been doing this with for over 40 years.
I believe that Marvin was entirely wrong when he said that sex was at the root of his problems. Far from it. Sex was just an ineffective means of trying to drain off surges of anxiety springing from more fundamental sources. Sometimes, as Freud first showed us, sexually inspired anxiety is expressed through other devious means. Perhaps just as often, the opposite is true. Other anxiety masquerades as sexual anxiety. The dream about the giant auger could not have been more clear. The ground under Marvin's feet was liquefying, an inspired visual image for groundlessness. And he was trying to combat that by drilling with his penis 65 feet. That is, 65 years down.
Okay, listen, symbolism? 65? Is it arbitrary?
The other dreams gave evidence of a savage world beneath Marvin's placid exterior. A world seething with death, murder, suicide, anger toward Phyllis, fears of dirty and menacing phantoms erupting from within. The blindfolded man,
This is what you get from dirty gypsies?
in the room where he and Phyllis were to make love, was particularly intriguing. When investigating sexual problems, it is always important to ask, are there more than two people present during lovemaking? The presence of others, phantoms or parents, rivals, other lovers, vastly complicates the sexual act. No, behavioral therapy was the best choice. It was best to keep the lid of this underworld sealed. The more I thought about it, the more pleased I was that I had restrained my curiosity and had acted selflessly and systematically in the best interests of the patient. But rationality and precision in psychotherapy are rarely rewarded. A few days later, Marvin called and asked for another appointment. I'd expected that Phyllis would accompany him, but he arrived alone, looking anxious and haggard. No opening ceremonies that day. He came right to the point. This is a bad day. I feel miserable. But first, I want to say that I appreciated your recommendation last week. To be honest, I'd expected you to advise me to come to see you 3 or 4 times a week for the next 3 or 4 years. I've been warned that you psychiatrists did that regardless of the problem. Not that I blame you. After all, you guys are running a business and gotta earn a living. Your advice about couples therapy made sense to me. Phyllis and I do have some communication problems, more than I really told you about last week. Actually, I understated the case to you. I've had some difficulties with sex. Not as bad now, which caused me to flip back and forth in my moods for 20 years. So I decided to take your advice, but Phyllis will not cooperate. She flat out refuses to see a shrink, a marriage therapist, a sex therapist, anyone. I asked her to come in one time today to talk to you, but she has dug in her heels. How come? I'll get to that, but first there are 2 things I want to cover today. Marvin stopped. At first I thought it was to catch his breath. He had been racing through his sentences. But he was composing himself. He turned away, blew his nose, and wiped his eyes surreptitiously. Then he continued. I'm way down. I had my worst migraine ever this week and had to go to the emergency room night before last for an injection. I thought you looked drawn today. The headaches are killing me. But to make things worse, I'm not sleeping. Last night I had a nightmare, which woke me up about 2 in the morning, and I kept replaying it all night long. I still can't get it out of my mind. Let's go over it. Marvin started to read the dream in such a mechanical manner that I stopped him and employed the old Fritz Perls device of asking him to begin again and to describe the dream in the present tense, as though he were experiencing it right now. Marvin put aside his notepad and from memory recited, "The 2 men are tall, pale, and very gaunt. In a dark meadow they glide along in silence. They are dressed entirely in black, with tall black stovepipe hats, long-tailed coats, black spats, and shoes. They resemble Victorian undertakers or temperance workers. Suddenly they come upon a carriage, ebony black, cradling a baby girl swaddled in black gauze. Wordlessly, one of the men begins to push the carriage. After a short distance he stops, walks around the front, and with his black cane, which now has a glowing white tip, he leans over, parts the gauze, and methodically inserts the white tip into the baby's vagina. I was transfixed by the dream. The stark images took form immediately in my own mind. I looked up in amazement at Marvin, who seemed unmoved and unappreciative of the power of his own creation, and the notion occurred to me that this could not be his dream. A dream like that could not have sprung from him. He was merely the medium through whose lips it was expressed. How could I wondered, meet the dreamer?
Okay, so who is the dreamer? Is it Marvin, the accountant, with his crazy little sex chart and his and not telling the full truth about the strangeness between him and his wife, and then he has these wild dreams that are just, and suddenly the therapist, I want to meet the dreamer. Well, where is the dreamer? Is the dreamer in Marvin? Is it Marvin? What's going on here?
Indeed, Marvin reinforced that whimsical notion. He had no sense of familiarity with the dream and related to it as though it were some alien text. He still experienced fear as he recited it, and shook his head as though he were trying to get the dream's bad taste out of his mouth. I focused on the anxiety. Why was the dream a nightmare? Precisely what part of it was frightening? As I think of it now, the last thing, that putting the cane in the baby's vagina, is the horrible part. Yet not when I was having the dream. It was everything else. The silent footsteps, the blackness, the sense of deep foreboding. The whole dream was soaked in fear. What feeling was there in the dream about the insertion of the cane into the baby's vagina? If anything, that part seemed almost soothing, as though it quieted the dream, or rather it tried to. It didn't really do it. None of this makes any sense to me. I've never believed in dreams. I wanted to linger with the dream, but had to return to
This masterful dreamer never believed in dreams.
the needs of the moment. The fact that Phyllis was unwilling to talk to me, even once, to help her husband, who was now in extremis, belied Marvin's account of his idyllic, harmonious marriage. I had to proceed with delicacy here because of his fear, which Phyllis obviously shared, that therapists snoop out and fan marital problems. But I had to be certain that she was inexorably opposed to couples therapy. Last week I had wondered if Marvin hadn't felt rejected by me. Perhaps this was a ploy to manipulate me into seeing him in individual therapy. How much of an effort had Marvin really made to persuade Phyllis to participate with him in treatment? Margaret assured me that she was very set in her ways. I told you she doesn't believe in psychiatry, but it goes far beyond that. She won't see any doctor. She hasn't had a GYN exam in 15 years, and it's all I could do to get her into the dentist when she's got a toothache. Suddenly, when I asked for other examples of Phyllis being set in her ways, some unexpected things came pouring out. Well, I might as well tell you the truth. No sense of spending good
This is set in her ways? She doesn't even go to the doctor? This woman's in her 60s.
money and sitting here and lying to you. Phyllis has her problems. The main thing is that she's afraid of going out of the house. That has a name, I've forgotten it. Agoraphobia. Yes, that's it. She's had it for years and years. She rarely leaves the house for any reason unless... Marvin's voice grew hushed and conspiratorial. It's to escape another fear. What other fear? The fear of people visiting the house. He went on to explain that they had not entertained guests at home for years, indeed for decades. If the situation demanded it, for example, if family members visited from out of town, Phyllis was willing to entertain them in a restaurant. An inexpensive restaurant, since Phyllis hates to spend money. Money was another reason, Marvin added, that she opposed psychotherapy. Moreover, Phyllis did not permit Marvin to entertain at home either. A couple of weeks ago, for example, some out-of-town guests called to ask if they could view his collection of political buttons. He said he didn't bother to ask Phyllis. He knew she'd raise hell. If he tried to force the issue, it would be, he said, a month of Sundays before he got laid again. Consequently, as he had done many times before, he spent the better part of a day packing up his whole collection to exhibit it in his office.
Now suddenly the life of this strange little accountant is quite a bit more interesting, and his marriage to this woman and what on earth is going on. But to listen to the accountant himself, his conscious self, well, there's not much there. But the dreamer, the dreamer's where all the work's going to happen.
This new information made it even more clear that Marvin and Phyllis very much needed marital therapy. But there was a new twist now. Marvin's first dream had so teemed with primitive iconography that the week before I had feared individual therapy might break the seal of this seething unconscious, and thought marital therapy would be safer. Now, however, with this evidence of severe pathology in their relationship, I wondered whether couples therapy might also unleash demons. I reiterated to Marvin that, all things considered, I still believe the treatment of choice to be behaviorally oriented couples therapy. But couples therapy requires a couple, and if Phyllis was not yet willing to come in, as he immediately reaffirmed, I told him I would be willing to see him in a trial of individual therapy. But be forewarned, individual treatment will most likely require many months, even a year or longer, and it will not be a rose garden. Painful thoughts or memories may emerge, which will temporarily make you more uncomfortable than you are right now. Marvin stated that he had thought about it during the last few days and wished to begin immediately. We arranged to meet twice weekly. It was apparent that both he and I had reservations. Marvin continued to be skeptical about the psychotherapeutic enterprise and showed little interest in an inner journey. He agreed to therapy only because the migraine had brought him to his knees, and he had nowhere else to turn. I, for my part, had reservations because I was so pessimistic about treatment. I agreed to work with him because I saw no other viable therapy option. But I could have referred him to someone else. There was another reason. That voice. The voice of that being who had created those astonishing dreams. Buried somewhere deep within Marvin's wall.
The voice of that being who had created those astonishing dreams
Was a dreamer tapping out an urgent existential message. I drifted back into the landscape of the dream, back into the silent dark world of the gaunt men, the black meadow, and the black gauzed baby girl. I thought of the incandescent tip of the cane and the sexual act that was not sex, but merely a futile attempt to dispel the dread. I wondered, if disguise were unnecessary, if the dreamer could speak to me without guile, what might he say? I am old. I am at the end of my life's work. I have no children, and I approach death.
Remember, Marvin's not saying this. This is that being who's a dreamer.
Full of dread. I am choking on darkness. I am choking on the silence of death. I think I know a way. I try to pierce the blackness with my sexual talisman, but it is not enough. But these were my reflections, not Marvin's. I asked him to associate to the dream, to think about it, and to say anything that came to mind. Nothing came. He merely shook his head. You shake your head no almost instantaneously. Try again. Give yourself a chance. Take any part of the dream and let your mind wander with it. Nothing whatsoever.
Nope, Marvin can't do it.
What do you make of the white-tipped cane? Marvin smirked. I was wondering when you were getting around to that. Didn't I say earlier that you fellows see sex at the root of everything? His accusation seemed particularly ironic because if there were one conviction I had about him, it was that sex was not the source of his difficulty. But it's your dream, Marvin, and your cane. You created it. What do you make of it? And what do you make of the allusions to death, undertaker, silence, blackness, the whole atmospheres of dread and foreboding? Given the choice of discussing the dream from the perspective of death or sex, Marvin, with dispatch, chose the latter. Well, you might be interested in something sexual that happened yesterday afternoon. That would be about 10 hours before the dream. I was lying in bed, still recovering from my migraine. Phyllis came over and gave me a head and neck massage. She then kept on going and massaged my back, then my legs, and then my penis. She undressed me and then took off all her clothes. This must have been an unusual event. Marvin had told me he initiated sex almost all of the time. I suspected that Phyllis wanted to expiate her guilt for refusing to see a couples therapist. At first, I wouldn't respond. How come? To tell you the truth, I was scared. I was just getting over my worst migraine, and I was afraid I'd fail and get another migraine. But Phyllis started sucking my cock and got me hard. I've never seen her so persistent. I finally said, let's go. A good lay might be just the thing to get rid of some of the tension. Marvin paused. Why do you stop? I'm trying to think of her exact words. Anyway, we started making love. I was doing pretty well, but just as I was getting ready to come, Phyllis said, there are other reasons for making love than to get rid of tension. Well, that did it. I lost it in a second. Marvin, did you tell Phyllis exactly how you felt about her timing? Her timing is not good, never has been. But I was too riled up to talk, afraid of what I'd say. If I say the wrong thing, she can make my life hell. Turn off the sexual spigot altogether. What sort of thing might you say? I'm afraid of my impulses, my murderous and sexual impulses. What do you mean? Do you remember years ago a news story of a man who killed his wife by pouring acid on her? Horrible thing. Yet I've often thought about that crime. I can understand how fury toward a woman could lead to a crime like that. Christ. Marvin's unconscious was closer to the surface than I thought. Remembering I hadn't wanted to take the lid off such primitive feelings, at least not this early in treatment, I switched from murder to sex. Marvin, you said you're frightened also by your sexual impulses. What do you mean? My sex drive's always been too strong. I've been told that's true of many bald men, a sign of too much male hormone. Is that true? I didn't want to encourage the distraction. I shrugged off the question. Keep going. Well, I've had to keep it under rein all my life because Phyllis has got strong ideas about how much sex we will have, and it's always the same. 2 times a week, some exceptions for birthdays and holidays.
Oh, the glory of marital sex.
You've got some feelings about that? Sometimes. But sometimes I think restraints are good. Without them, I might run wild. That was a curious comment. What does running wild mean? Do you mean extramarital affairs? My question shocked Marvin. I've never been unfaithful to Phyllis. Never will be. Well, what do you mean by running wild? Marvin looked stumped. I had a sense he was talking about things he had never discussed before. I was excited for him. It had been one hell of an hour's work. I wanted him to continue, and I just waited. I don't know what I mean, but at times I wondered what it would have been like to have married a woman with a sex drive like mine, a woman who wanted and enjoyed sex as much as me. What do you think? Your life would have been very different? Let me back up a minute. I shouldn't have used the word enjoy a few minutes ago. Phyllis enjoys sex. It's just that she never seems to want it. Instead, she, dispenses it, if I'm good. These are the times when I feel cheated and angry. Marvin paused. He loosened his collar, rubbed his neck, and rolled his head around. He was getting rid of tension, but I imagined him to be looking around the room as though to assure himself no one else was listening. You look uncomfortable. What are you feeling? Disloyal? Like I shouldn't have been saying these things about Phyllis, almost like she'll find out about it. You give her a lot of power. Sooner or later, we're going to need to find out all about that. Marvin continued to be refreshingly open during the first several weeks of therapy. All in all, he did far better than I had expected. He was cooperative. He relinquished his pugnacious skepticism about psychiatry. He did his homework, came prepared for the sessions, and was determined, as he put it, to get a good return on his investment. His confidence in therapy was boosted by an unexpected early dividend. His migraines mysteriously and completely disappeared as soon as he started treatment, although his intense sex-spawned mood swings continued.
Okay, now pay attention. This is a physical, all this narrative work, especially the work that the dreamer's offering, is having a payoff.
During this early phase of therapy, we concentrated on two issues: his marriage and, to a lesser extent because of his resistance, the implications of his retirement. But I was careful to tread a fine line. I felt like a surgeon, preparing the operative field but avoiding any deep dissection. I wanted Marvin to explore these issues, but not too searchingly, not enough to destabilize the precarious marital equilibrium he and Phyllis had established, and thus drive him immediately out of therapy, and not enough to evoke any further death anxiety, and thus ignite further migraines. At the same time as was I conducting this gentle, somewhat concrete therapy with Marvin, I was also engaged in a fascinating discourse with the dreamer, that vastly enlightened homunculus housed, or one might say jailed, by Marvin, who was either ignorant of the dreamer's existence or allowed him to communicate with me in a spirit of benign indifference. When Marvin and I strolled and casually conversed on superficial levels, the dreamer drummed out a constant stream of messages from the depths. Perhaps my discourse with the dreamer was
It's, the homunculus deep below the surface just tapping out these little messages, say, doctor, pay attention to this. Marvin on the surface, completely unaware.
Productive. Perhaps I was willing to permit Marvin a slower pace because of my encounter with the dreamer. I remember beginning every hour, not with excitement about seeing Marvin, but with anticipation about my next communique from the dreamer. Sometimes the dreams, like the first ones, were frightening expressions of ontological anxiety. Sometimes they foreshadowed things to come in therapy. Sometimes they were like subtitles to therapy, providing a vivid translation of Marvin's cautious statements to me. After the first few sessions, I began to receive hopeful messages.
Hopeful messages from the dreamer.
The teacher in a boarding room was looking around for children who were interested in painting on a large blank canvas. Later, I was telling a small, pudgy boy, obviously myself, about it, and he got so excited he began to cry. No mistaking that message. Marvin senses he's being offered an opportunity by someone, undoubtedly you, his therapist, to start all over again. How exciting to be given another chance to paint his life all over again on a blank canvas. Other hopeful dreams followed. I'm at a wedding, and a woman comes up and says she is my long-forgotten daughter. I'm surprised because I didn't know I had a daughter. She's middle-aged and dressed in rich brown colors. We had only a couple of hours to talk. I asked her about the conditions of her life, but she couldn't talk about that. I was sorry when she left, but we agreed to correspond. The message? Marvin for the first time discovers his daughter, the feminine, softer, sensitive side of himself. He's fascinated. The possibilities are limitless. He considers establishing ongoing communication. Perhaps he can colonize the newfound islets of himself. Another dream. I look out the window and hear a commotion in the shrubbery. It is a cat chasing a mouse. I feel sorry for the mouse and go outside to it. What I find are two baby kittens who have not yet opened their eyes. I run to tell Phyllis about it because she's so fond of kittens. The message. Marvin understands, he really understands, that his eyes have been closed and that he is finally preparing to open them. He's excited for Phyllis, who is about to open her eyes. But be careful. He suspects you of playing a cat-and-mouse game.
All right, and it's far enough to make the point, and if you want to get the rest of it, just pick up the book. It's a book's been around for quite a while. The audiobook is great. But are these arbitrary messages? These strange stories about cats and undertakers and gauze-covered babies and dirty gypsies and. Are these arbitrary? Or, well, as you'll see if you read the rest of the story, the dreamer basically helps the doctor with Marvin and Phyllis. And the story has a happy ending. We are mysterious creatures, aren't we? We hear all these symbolic things and we think, well, these are arbitrary. These make no sense. Well, sometimes they can be arbitrary. I mean, again, if I talk to a schizophrenic, well, But even then, I'll have to be a little careful, because are they really arbitrary? Again, I haven't read much Jung, but in that sort of autobiography he wrote, I mean, you have to hand it to the man who he goes and, as a young doctor, starts working in a hospital, and the other doctors say, don't bother talking to the patients, they're crazy. Well, isn't that why we're here? To figure out a little bit something about craziness and just how deep and mysterious the world is, and whether, in fact, payoff in the narrative realm can pay huge dividends in all the other realms, in the realms of Marvin's difficulty in bed and his migraines and his difficulty with his wife and so on and so forth. So it's a great story. It's a great book. And but I wanted to leave it there. Well, I don't want to leave it there. I just don't have any more time this afternoon. But you can get the book yourself. And as we continue through, well, I've got a lot of videos I've got to continue through, but these questions about, well, how on earth can we navigate our lives, not only so that they impact our lives, but that we are contributing plants to a field or contributing laborers to a cathedral that far outlives us and goes far, far into the future. How can that be? So that's enough for today. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.